In the unforgiving West, true love is not found. It is forged, like steel, in the fire of hardship and the quiet courage of two hearts beating as one. The dust of San Miguel, Arizona, was a fine powder that settled on everything, coating the soul itself in a layer of grit. It was to this parched town, to the low adobe house of the old healer Inez, that two Kiowa warriors brought their chief. Tahoe, a name once spoken with fear and respect across the prairies, was now a broken man carried on a litter. His body burned with fever, and the wound in his side, dark and angry, wept a poison that stole the life from him. The air in the small room grew heavy with the scent of sickness and the silent desperation of his men. They looked to the old woman, their faces like stone masks, hiding a deep fear for the man who was their nation's heart. Inez, a woman whose face was a map of hard years and lost hopes, looked at the dying chief and shook her head slowly. Her eyes, clouded with the wisdom of survival, saw not a man to be saved, but a danger to be avoided. A poisoned wound meant a bounty hunter was near. Healing a chief meant bringing the wrath of the cavalry down upon their quiet town. "I cannot," she said, her voice dry as the desert wind. "This is a death I will not invite into my home." The warriors, shoulders slumped, a barely perceptible sign of their defeat. They had come to the end of the trail and found no hope waiting for them, only the finality of a closed door. But as the warriors prepared to leave, a voice, quiet yet firm, cut through the heavy silence. "I will care for him." Eleanor, the healer's apprentice, stepped from the shadows. She was the daughter of a doctor who had once served this frontier, a man who believed in his oath above all else. In the fading light, she saw not a Kiowa, not a threat, but a human being trembling on the edge of the abyss. Her father's legacy was a fire in her blood, a duty she could not ignore. She faced her mentor's sharp, disapproving gaze without flinching, her resolve hardening into a quiet certainty that filled the small, tense room. Inez scoffed, a harsh, brittle sound. "You are a fool, child. You will bring ruin upon us all." But Eleanor did not waver. She knelt beside the unconscious man, her fingers gently brushing his fevered brow. She felt the fierce heat radiating from his skin, a life force fighting a losing battle. The two warriors watched her, their dark eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and a sliver of renewed hope. They saw the compassion in her touch, but also a professional focus that was unexpected. In that moment, a silent pact was formed. A young woman, armed with inherited knowledge and a defiant heart, had chosen her side in a war against death itself. Eleanor had left Philadelphia behind, a world of silk gowns and polite lies that felt more suffocating than the desert heat. After her father's tragic death, she journeyed west, not as an escape, but as a pilgrimage. She sought to continue his work, armed with his most precious possession: leather-bound journals filled with meticulous notes on herbs, remedies, and the subtle poisons of the frontier. They were her inheritance, more valuable than any fortune. She had traded a life of comfort for one of purpose, a purpose that now lay unconscious before her, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps that seemed to count down his final moments. By the dim light of an oil lamp, she turned the brittle pages of her father's journals. His elegant script detailed the effects of various toxins. She soon found what she feared. The poison in Tahoe's wound was slow, insidious, designed to burn a man from the inside out. The first days were a desperate battle. Eleanor worked tirelessly, her hands stained with herbs, her face pale with exhaustion. She prepared poultices of wormwood and echinacea, forcing bitter teas between the chief's cracked lips. The small room filled with the sharp, clean scent of medicine, a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness that sought to claim the warrior. As she worked, she spoke to him, her voice a low murmur against the silence. She did not know if he could hear, but the words needed to be said. "My father would have done this," she whispered, wiping his brow with a cool cloth. "He believed every life was a world unto itself." She told him of her own gilded cage in the city, of a loneliness so profound it echoed in the grandest ballrooms. In this dusty, sun-baked room, tending to a man her world would call a savage, she felt more alive, more connected to humanity than she ever had before. Her confession hung in the air, a bridge of shared vulnerability. Meanwhile, a shadow fell over the town of San Miguel. A man named Jedediah Roper dismounted in front of the saloon, his movements economical and predatory. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the street with cold appraisal. He was the bounty hunter who had put the bullet in Tahoe, and he had come to collect his prize. He pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon, the cheerful piano music faltering as he entered. The men at the bar fell silent, their eyes following the newcomer. Roper ordered a whiskey, his gaze lingering on the dusty street outside, his patience as thin as a razor's edge. The hunt was not over yet. On the third night they came. 3 Kiowa warriors, led by a man whose weathered face and fierce eyes identified him as a leader. It was Flying Deer, Tahoe's most trusted lieutenant. They stood at the threshold of the small adobe house, their presence filling the doorway, their silence more intimidating than any threat. Their faces were grim, their expressions a mixture of grief and distrust. They had come to take their chief, to allow him to die among his own people, on his own terms, not in a dusty room surrounded by strangers. Their gaze fell upon Eleanor, sharp and questioning, demanding an explanation for her defiance. Eleanor met their gaze without fear. She was weary, her body aching from lack of sleep, but her voice was steady. "I am not fighting the fever," she explained, her words careful and clear. "I am fighting the poison in his blood. There is still hope." She opened one of her father's journals, turning to a page with a detailed drawing of a plant with distinct purple flowers. "This is the source of the poison. My father studied it. I believe I can find the antidote." She was not just a compassionate woman, she was a professional, armed with knowledge they did not possess. This changed the dynamic of the confrontation entirely. Flying Deer studied her, his gaze moving from her determined face to the unconscious form of his chief. He saw no pity in her eyes, only a fierce resolve. He was a warrior who respected strength, and he saw it in her now. After a long, tense silence, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "We will wait," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We will make our camp outside the town. But if he dies—" The unspoken threat hung in the air. Eleanor simply nodded back. "I understand." A fragile truce had been forged, one built on a foundation of desperate hope and the authority of a dead man's knowledge. Jedediah Roper, his patience wearing thin, paid a visit to Sheriff Coltrane. The sheriff was a tired man, his face lined with the worries of keeping peace in a lawless land. He wanted nothing more than a quiet life. "That Kiowa chief is my property, Sheriff," Roper stated, his voice devoid of emotion. He leaned against the frame of the office door, a predator at rest. "I have a warrant. I intend to collect my bounty one way or another. Whether he is breathing or not makes little difference to me." Coltrane sighed, the weight of the town's fragile peace settling heavily on his shoulders. A storm was coming. 10 days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and exhausting work. The small adobe house became Eleanor's entire world. She lived by the rhythm of Tahoe's breathing, her hopes rising and falling with each shallow breath. Then, one afternoon, while grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, she found it. In the back of her father's final journal was a hastily scribbled note about a rare, pale root found only in the shaded canyons. It was the antidote. Hope, fierce and bright, surged through her. She sent word to Flying Deer, and one of his young warriors was dispatched immediately, disappearing into the hills like a phantom. The warrior returned as the sun was setting, his hands cupped around 3 gnarled, pale roots. Eleanor worked quickly, preparing a decoction, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. She carefully administered the liquid to Tahoe, drop by agonizing drop. For hours, nothing changed. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the raging heat of his skin began to subside. The fever was breaking. Eleanor watched, barely daring to breathe, as the tense lines on his face began to soften. The poison was losing its grip. The battle was turning. She had won a crucial victory in her silent war. That evening, Tahoe opened his eyes. The delirium was gone, replaced by a weary but lucid gaze. His eyes found Eleanor, sitting slumped in a chair beside him. "Water," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. Joy, sharp and overwhelming, shot through Eleanor. She quickly brought a cup to his lips, supporting his head with her hand. After he drank, he looked at her again, his dark eyes searching her face. "Why do you do this?" he asked, the words a faint whisper. "My father taught me that a life is a life," she answered softly. "Its value cannot be measured in gold." It was the simplest truth she knew. A bitter smile touched Tahoe's lips. "Tell that to the man who shot me. To men like Roper, my life has a very specific price." The effort of speaking exhausted him, and his eyes drifted closed again. But this time, it was not the stupor of fever but a deep, healing sleep. From the doorway, Flying Deer watched the exchange, his stern face unreadable. He had seen the brief moment of clarity in his chief's eyes. He had heard the quiet words spoken between the warrior and the healer. He gave Eleanor a slow, deliberate nod of respect before melting back into the shadows. The wall of suspicion had begun to crumble. News in a small town travels faster than a prairie fire. The word that Chief Tahoe was not only alive but recovering spread from the saloon to the general store. It infuriated Jedediah Roper. His reputation was on the line, and his bounty was slipping through his fingers. He could not wait any longer. That night, under the cold gaze of a sliver moon, he and his 2 hired thugs made their move. They approached the healer's house, their boots crunching softly on the dusty ground. They intended to take what they believed was theirs, and they were not concerned with who stood in their way. Their intentions were as dark as the shadows they moved through. But a figure blocked their path. Sheriff Coltrane stood before the door, a sturdy shotgun held loosely in his hands. He was not a hero, and he hated confrontation, but there was a line of decency he would not cross. "This is as far as you go, Roper," he said, his voice low and steady. "There is law in this town. Even for you." Roper's hand hovered over the butt of his revolver. "This does not concern you, Sheriff. Stand aside." The air crackled with tension. The lives of everyone in the small adobe house hung on the resolve of one tired man who had decided to make a stand for what was right. Inside, Eleanor heard the muffled, angry voices. The strain of the past weeks, combined with the new terror, was too much. She sank onto a stool, her head in her hands, her strength finally failing her. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and the room began to spin. She felt a gentle touch on her shoulder and looked up, startled. Tahoe, his body still weak, but his eyes clear and alert, was holding out a cup of water to her. He had pulled himself up, his face etched with effort, to come to her aid. In that instant, their roles were completely reversed. The patient had become the caregiver. "Now, it is my turn to care for you," he said, his voice a low rasp, but filled with a strength that had been absent for weeks. Eleanor looked at him, at the concern in his dark eyes, and a connection, deeper than she could have imagined, formed between them. It was a bond forged not just in sickness and healing, but in a shared moment of vulnerability and reversed care. As she took the cup, their fingers brushed, sending a quiet jolt through them both. It was more than the gratitude of a patient. It was the silent acknowledgement of 2 souls who had seen the strength and honor in each other. With each passing day, Tahoe's strength returned. The poison was gone, leaving behind only a deep weariness that sleep began to mend. He was soon able to sit up in his bed, propped against the adobe wall. The long, silent hours were replaced by quiet conversation. He spoke of his people, of the endless plains and the sky that was their temple. He described the traditions that bound them together, the stories of the elders, and the heavy weight of leadership in a world that was shrinking around them. His voice, though still weak, carried the authority of a man born to lead, a man who grieved for a way of life that was vanishing. Eleanor listened, captivated. In turn, she shared her own stories. She spoke of her father, of his unwavering belief in medicine as a bridge between peoples. She described his dream of building a clinic on the frontier, a place where a man's wounds would be treated without regard for the color of his skin or the god he prayed to. He saw the future, she said softly, a future where knowledge could heal more than just the body. She confessed that his dream had now become her own, a guiding star in the vast, lonely expanse of the West. It was a purpose she now held on to tightly. Tahoe watched her as she spoke, a look of surprise and profound respect in his eyes. He saw past the fair skin and the different dress. He saw a spirit that mirrored his own. She was a warrior, just as he was. Her weapons were not the lance and the bow, but knowledge, compassion, and an unyielding will. He saw a leader, one who fought not for land or glory, but for the simple, sacred idea that every life mattered. This shared understanding created a bond between them that transcended the boundaries of their two very different worlds, a silent respect that was deeper than words. Outside the town, Flying Deer watched the change in his chief. He saw not just a body healing, but a spirit rekindling. The despair that had clouded Tahoe's eyes was being replaced by a new light. Seeing the power of Eleanor's medicine and the profound effect she was having on his leader, Flying Deer's own rigid beliefs began to soften. One evening he brought Eleanor a pouch of dried leaves. "This is from my people," he said gruffly. "It eases pain and helps the body rest." He began sharing his tribe's ancient knowledge, complementing her scientific methods with centuries of Kiowa wisdom. The bridge between their worlds was being built. The story of the woman who had saved the Kiowa chief spread like wildfire across the territory. Soon, a small, steady trickle of people began to arrive at Inez's door. A Mexican farmer carried his daughter, her small body burning with fever. An old prospector, his hand badly injured in a rock slide, sought her help. Even the wife of a local rancher, a woman who had previously looked at Eleanor with disdain, came to her in secret for a persistent cough. Eleanor, with Inez now working willingly by her side, turned no one away. The small adobe house was transformed into a humble but effective infirmary. This only fueled Jedediah Roper's rage. Every person Eleanor healed was a testament to her growing influence and a blow to his own authority. He began to spend his days in the saloon, his whispers turning to loud pronouncements. "She is a witch," he would snarl to anyone who would listen, "in league with those heathens. She will bring a curse down on this town." He tried to poison the minds of the townsfolk, preying on their fears and prejudices, but his words were empty threats against the evidence of her good deeds. The people saw her healing hands, not the witch he described. One afternoon, his frustration boiled over. A young Kiowa warrior had come into town for supplies, his manner quiet and respectful. Roper, fueled by whiskey and resentment, confronted him in the middle of the street, shoving him hard. "What are you savages doing in a decent town?" he spat. Before the situation could escalate, Sheriff Coltrane intervened. He grabbed Roper by the collar, his face a mask of cold fury. "That is enough, Roper. You will spend the night in a cell to cool your head." The public humiliation was a deep blow to Roper's pride, making him even more dangerous. Tahoe, now strong enough to walk with the aid of a cane, watched all of this with a growing sense of unease. He saw the good Eleanor was doing, but he also saw the storm gathering on the horizon. "You have made an enemy," he told her one evening, his voice heavy with concern. "A man like Roper does not forgive. He only waits for his moment to strike." Eleanor met his gaze, her own expression serious. "Then we will be ready for him," she said, her voice steady. "I did not come this far to be frightened away by a bully." Their alliance was no longer just about healing. It had become a partnership against a shared threat. The day came when Tahoe could finally walk outside, leaning on a sturdy cane but with his head held high. The sunlight seemed to give him strength, and the dignity of a chief returned to his bearing. He stood before the small adobe house, breathing in the dry desert air, a man reborn from the ashes of his own despair. He was ready to return to his people. His recovery was a miracle to the townsfolk, and a symbol of profound hope to the Kiowa warriors who had kept their patient vigil. For Jedediah Roper, however, it was the final insult. His prize was about to walk away free and clear. His time for waiting was over. Roper, his face dark with fury, gathered his two thugs. They rode to the sheriff's office, their horses kicking up dust in the quiet street. Roper did not dismount. He looked down at Sheriff Coltrane with contempt. "You have until sunset, Sheriff," he announced, his voice carrying across the street. "You will deliver the Kiowa to me. If you do not, we will burn this town to the ground, starting with that healer's house." The threat was absolute. He turned his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a wave of terror in his wake. The town of San Miguel was now a hostage. Fear gripped the town. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered. In the saloon, nervous men spoke in hushed tones. Some argued for giving Roper what he wanted. "He is just one man," a merchant pleaded with the sheriff. "Is his life worth our homes, our families?" Sheriff Coltrane listened, his face grim. He was caught in an impossible position. To surrender Tahoe would be to betray every principle he held. To resist would be to condemn the people he was sworn to protect to a violent and fiery fate. He stood alone in his office, the weight of the town's future pressing down on him, a solitary man facing an impossible choice. Eleanor watched the town close in on itself, her heart heavy with dread. She had brought this trouble, her act of compassion now the catalyst for a potential disaster. She looked at Tahoe, who stood by the window, his expression grim as he watched the panicked town. The silence between them was thick with unspoken fears. This was no longer about one man's life. It was about the soul of a community. Would they stand together against tyranny, or would they sacrifice one for the sake of many? This setting sun began to paint the sky in bloody shades of orange and red, counting down the minutes to the town's fateful decision. Tahoe turned from the window, his decision made. His face was calm, the face of a chief who had accepted his fate. "I will not be the cause of this town's destruction," he said to Eleanor, his voice firm. "They must not suffer for what I am." He would not hide. He would not allow others to pay the price for his life. He went to find the sheriff, and together, in the small, dusty office, the three of them, the chief, the healer, and the lawman, devised a desperate plan. It was a gamble, a long shot that depended on the courage of ordinary people who had been pushed too far. They would face the darkness together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the main street in long, dramatic shadows, Tahoe walked out to face his enemy. He stood alone in the middle of the dusty street, armed with only his cane and his unwavering dignity. A moment later, Roper and his two men rode into view, their figures silhouetted against the dying light. A cruel smile spread across Roper's face. He had won. He spurred his horse forward, ready to claim his prize. The street was silent. The entire town holding its breath, watching the lone figure of the chief stand against the approaching riders. But as Roper drew near, a sound broke the silence, the click of a rifle hammer being pulled back. Then another. And another. Suddenly, the windows and doorways of the buildings lining the street were filled with armed townsfolk, their faces grim and determined. Sheriff Coltrane stepped out of his office, his shotgun leveled. At the far end of the street, Flying Deer and his Kiowa warriors emerged, blocking any chance of retreat. Roper was surrounded. He was trapped not by a single lawman but by the united will of two peoples who had chosen to stand together. The hunter had become the hunted. Panic and rage flashed in Roper's eyes. He drew his revolver and aimed it at Tahoe, a final, desperate act of malice. But before he could fire, a shot rang out from the sheriff's shotgun, the blast echoing through the street. The revolver flew from Roper's hand, spinning in the dust. Tahoe walked slowly toward his disarmed foe, looking down at the man who had caused so much pain. After a long moment, he turned to Sheriff Coltrane. "He is yours, Sheriff," Tahoe said, his voice clear and strong. "Let the white man's law deal with him. My revenge is that I am alive." Jedediah Roper and his men were bound and taken away by federal marshals to face trial. The threat that had hung over San Miguel was finally gone. The next morning, a sense of quiet relief settled over the town. On the dusty main street, Tahoe and the Kiowa elders met with Sheriff Coltrane and the town council. There, under the warm Arizona sun, they signed a treaty of peace, an agreement forged not in politics, but in the shared experience of standing together against a common enemy. It was a pact sealed by the mutual respect that had been born from Eleanor's single act of defiance and compassion. When the time came for Tahoe and his people to leave, he sought out Eleanor. He found her standing outside the small adobe house that had become a sanctuary for so many. "You gave me back my life," he said, his voice filled with an emotion he rarely showed. "But you also gave me hope. I must return to my people. They need their leader." He looked at her, and in his dark eyes she saw a profound sadness, the pain of a coming separation that she felt just as keenly. The town needed its healer, and his nation needed its chief. Their paths seemed destined to diverge once more. Eleanor's heart ached. The thought of him leaving felt like a physical wound. "My father," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "He dreamed of a hospital, a place for everyone, for your people and for mine." She looked up at him, her own hope a fragile flame against the wind of their impending separation. Perhaps we could build it together, here, on the line between our two worlds, a place of healing." It was more than a suggestion. It was a plea, a declaration of a future she desperately wanted, a future with him by her side. Tahoe looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and filled them with a brilliant light. He took both of her hands in his. The warmth of his touch was solid, real. "That," he said softly, his voice a low, reverent murmur, "is a better dream than I could have ever imagined for myself." They stood together as the sun set, no longer just a chief and a healer, but partners. They would remain in San Miguel, their shared work and growing love becoming a living symbol, proof that even in the harsh, unforgiving land of the West, hope could build a bridge strong enough for two worlds to cross.